He handed her bedroom key to another woman while she was still carrying his child. Not in anger, not in cruelty. With the calm, deliberate efficiency of a man rearranging furniture. Elena Marlowe stood in the hallway of that lakeside mansion, 7 weeks pregnant, hands trembling, and watched Bianca Serrano turn the key in the lock of what was supposed to be her room. Dante Vescari stood 3 feet away and said nothing. That was the moment Elena understood. Not the betrayal, not the humiliation. Something quieter and more devastating than either of those things. She understood that she had never been a woman to him. She had been a position, and positions can always be filled. If that were you, carrying someone's child, having given them 3 years of your life, what would you do next? If this story is already pulling at something inside you, subscribe right now. And hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't come around often. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The night Elena found out she was pregnant, it was raining in Chicago. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain that signals something important is about to happen in the movies. This was the ordinary, miserable kind, cold and sideways and completely indifferent to what she was feeling. The kind of rain that doesn't care about your life. She sat on the bathroom floor of Dante's penthouse for 11 minutes after the test came back positive. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on the wall above the towel rack, counting the seconds the way she used to count inventory numbers when she was nervous. Her brain defaulted to measurement when her emotions got too big for her body. 2 lines. She had taken 3 tests. All 3 were lined up on the tile in front of her like evidence. Elena Marlowe was 31 years old. She had spent the last 3 years as Dante Vescari's most trusted partner, his closest advisor, the woman who saw every moving piece of his empire before anyone else did, and quietly made sure none of them collided with each other. She understood his business better than his own lieutenants. She had once caught a money laundering discrepancy in a subsidiary account that saved him $2 million and a federal investigation, and she had done it on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked. She also loved him. That was the complicating part. It was never supposed to be that complicated. She hadn't planned it. Nobody plans to fall in love with a man who runs organized crime in the 3rd largest city in the country. It happened the way most inconvenient things happen, gradually, and then all at once, until one day you're sitting on a bathroom floor counting pregnancy tests and realizing your entire life has been quietly rearranged without your permission. She picked up the first test, set it back down. 3 years, she thought, 3 years of choosing him. 3 years of knowing, in the private part of her mind she didn't let anyone visit, that the situation was complicated, that she occupied a space in his life that didn't have a clean name. Not girlfriend, not wife, not employee exactly, though she was paid. She was something more specific and less protected than any of those things. She was Elena Marlowe, and Dante Vescari needed her in a way he had never once admitted out loud. She stood up, looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were dry. She noticed that and wasn't sure how to feel about it. She had assumed that if this ever happened, and she had thought about it privately, in those small, hopeful corners of her mind, she would cry. Out of fear or joy or both at once. Instead, she just looked like herself, but slightly more focused, like someone who had just been handed a very important problem and was already beginning to organize her approach. She picked up her phone, put it back down, picked it up again. She didn't call him that night. She needed one night to just be the only person who knew. One night where the information belonged entirely to her, before she handed it to the man who would immediately begin deciding what to do with it. She lay in the bed they shared in his penthouse on the 42nd floor, and she listened to the rain hit the windows, and she thought, this changes everything. Everything is about to change. She was right about that. She just had no idea which direction the change was coming from. She told him the next evening. She had rehearsed it, which in retrospect she recognized as a sign that something in her already knew. You don't rehearse conversations with people who make you feel safe. You rehearse the ones where you're not entirely sure how the other person is going to react. Dante was standing at the window when she came in, the wide, floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city like a king surveying territory. He had a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched. That was how she knew he'd had a hard day. He only poured scotch when it was bad. He only left it untouched when it was worse. There's something I need to tell you, Elena said. He turned, and for a half second, just a half second, she saw the man she had fallen in love with. Not the mafia boss, not the cold, calculating architect of a criminal organization, just the man, tired around the eyes, carrying something heavy. Sit down first, he said. I'm fine standing. He looked at her for a moment, reading her the way he read everything, measuring, calculating. Then he set down his glass. Tell me. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It wasn't the held breath silence of movies. It was the specific silence of a very intelligent man rapidly processing information against a backdrop of complications he hadn't anticipated. Dante didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, How far along? 7 weeks. Another pause. Are you certain? 3 tests. She kept her voice even. I'm certain. She watched him. She knew his face well enough by now to read the small signals, the slight tension around his jaw, the way his eyes went very still when he was thinking hard. She watched him think. She watched him arrive somewhere, make a decision, and then carefully arrange his expression around it. And that arrangement, that was the first small crack. Elena. He crossed the room. He took her face in his hands with a gentleness that she knew was genuine, because Dante Vescari was not a gentle man, and the moments when he tried were always slightly awkward, which was somehow what made them real. I need to think about the timing. The timing, she repeated. There is a war coming inside the organization. I can't. He stopped, started again. Acknowledging this publicly right now would create vulnerabilities. Enemies would see it as a weakness. If they knew I had a child on the way, that I had something to lose, you're asking me to hide it. I'm asking you to give me time. She stepped back. His hands dropped. How much time? 6 months. Maybe less. Until this situation with the Carrera faction is resolved. 6 months. She was going to be visibly pregnant in 6 months. Visibly, obviously, undeniably carrying his child, and he was asking her to do it quietly, in the background, where nobody important would notice. She looked at the man she loved and felt something shift. Not break, not yet. Just shift. And after the 6 months, she asked? He looked at her steadily. Everything changes. She held that promise in her hands for a moment. She had been holding variations of that promise for 3 years. When the Moretti situation settles, when the expansion is finished, when the alliance is solid, everything changes. Everything is about to change. Just wait a little longer. Okay, she said. She went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling and told herself it made sense. He was a man operating in a world where showing weakness got people killed. She understood that world. She had lived adjacent to it for 3 years. Patience wasn't weakness. Patience was strategy. She told herself that for 11 days. She overheard him on a Thursday. She hadn't meant to. She was coming back early from a meeting across town. A legitimate meeting, one of the financial advisory sessions she conducted through the shell company that kept her income clean and her name off anything that could cause problems. Traffic had been light. She had come back 40 minutes before she was expected. The study door was slightly open. She heard Bianca Serrano's name before she heard anything else. Bianca, who was 28 and elegant and the daughter of a man named Rodrigo Serrano, whose organization controlled the eastern shipping corridors that Dante needed for the next phase of his expansion. Bianca, who appeared at certain Vescari functions in certain rooms and smiled at certain people in a certain way that Elena had noticed and catalogued and quietly filed under, do not think about this too hard. Elena stopped walking. Your father and I have already discussed the timeline, Dante was saying. Nothing changes. I give you my word. A pause. Bianca's voice, lower, less distinct through the door. Dante again. The alliance moves forward as planned. The other situation is being handled. I told you it wouldn't affect us. The other situation. Elena put one hand flat against the wall. She knew his voice. She knew every register of it. The cold business voice, the warning voice, the rare and careful voice he used only with her in the dark. The voice she was hearing now was the reassurance voice. The voice he used when someone needed to believe something and he needed them to believe it completely. He was reassuring Bianca Serrano that their future was intact. While Elena was 7 weeks pregnant in the hallway, she didn't make a sound. She stood perfectly still and she listened, and she felt something inside her. Not the shift from 11 days ago, something bigger than that, quietly, irrevocably settle. She walked to the kitchen. She made herself a glass of water. She drank it standing at the counter. She heard the study door open and close. She heard Bianca's heels on the marble. She heard the elevator. She put her glass in the sink. Then she went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen, her desk, the small one she'd claimed when she realized she spent more time working here than he did, and she opened her laptop. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not immediately call anyone. She opened a new browser tab, and she began to think. The thinking took 3 weeks. Elena was not an impulsive person. She had survived 3 years in close proximity to a criminal organization by being the opposite of impulsive. She watched. She measured. She calculated risk. She understood that the difference between a good decision and a catastrophic one was usually just the amount of information you gathered before you acted. She gathered information. She made phone calls. She kept short and vague. She moved money, the legitimate money, the money she had earned that lived in accounts bearing only her name, into a configuration that was more useful to someone who might need to move quickly. She identified an apartment, a place that had no connection to anyone Dante knew, in a neighborhood that nobody who worked for him would think to look. She did all of this the way she did everything, methodically, without drama, in the margins of ordinary days. And the whole time she did it, Dante came home for dinner, sat across from her at the table, and talked about the Carrera situation and the expansion timelines and the problem with the North Side distribution network, and she listened and asked useful questions and occasionally caught the warning signs he'd missed, because she always caught the warning signs he'd missed. And he would look at her with that particular expression he had, the one that meant, "This is why I need you," and she would feel the whole complicated weight of it pressing against her chest. She was still in love with him. That was the hardest part to hold on to without breaking. She was making plans to leave the man she loved, while sitting across a dinner table from him, while carrying his child. She had cried exactly once. In the shower, early on a Sunday morning, for about 6 minutes. Then she had turned the water colder, finished washing her hair, and gotten dressed. She told herself he made his choice, not in that room with Bianca. Earlier than that, every time she had asked, quietly, where this was going, and he had said later. Every time she had sat across from him at functions and introduced herself as a business associate because that was the story that protected the empire. Every time he had promised that everything would change and then changed nothing. He had made 1,000 small choices. She was going to make one large one. She was just waiting for the right moment. The right moment arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, in the form of a phone call from a woman named Marguerite, who handled logistics for a property management company that Dante used for several of his legitimate holdings. "Mr. Vescari would like you to see the property before the arrangements are finalized," Marguerite said. "Which property?" Elena asked. "The Lakeside Estate. He's asked me to coordinate the household setup with you for the residential arrangements." A brief pause. "For both of you." Elena went still. "Both of whom?" Marguerite's voice shifted slightly. The shift of someone who has just realized they've said something they shouldn't have and is now calculating how to recover. "I was under the impression you were both aware of the arrangement. Walk me through the arrangement." Another pause, longer this time. "Perhaps it would be better if Mr. Vescari explained." "Marguerite," Elena's voice was perfectly calm. "Walk me through the arrangement." The woman walked her through it. A 6-bedroom lakeside estate, 40 minutes outside the city. Elena would have the east wing. Private entrance, private gardens, full household staff, private medical team on call. Security around the clock. Bianca Serrano would have the primary suite in the main house. Elena set her phone face down on the desk. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she had saved 3 weeks ago and not yet used. It rang twice. "Caleb," she said, "I'm ready." She had never been more certain of anything in her life. Caleb Rourke picked up on the second ring, the way he always had, the way he always would, without fanfare, without drama, like a man who had simply been waiting near the phone and wasn't embarrassed to admit it. "Elena." His voice was the same as she remembered, unhurried. Steady the way certain old buildings are steady, not because nothing has ever hit them, but because what hit them didn't take them down. "I need to meet," she said. "Not over the phone. Tomorrow morning, my office, 8 o'clock. No questions, No, are you okay, or what happened, or how bad is it? Just a time and a place. She almost said thank you. Instead, she said, I'll be there, and hung up. She sat at her desk for another 4 minutes. The apartment was quiet. Dante was across town, dealing with whatever the Carrera situation had become this week. She could hear the refrigerator humming. She could hear traffic 20 floors below. She opened a drawer and took out the folders she had been quietly assembling for 3 weeks. Bank statements. Lease agreements. A list of contacts she trusted, people who owed their loyalty to her, not to the Vescari name. A copy of her own employment records, the legitimate ones, from the shell company that processed her consulting fees. She looked at the folder for a long moment. Then she put it in her bag, under her laptop, under a paperback novel she hadn't read in 2 months. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. Caleb's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in River North, the kind of building that housed marketing firms and financial consultants and the occasional security company that nobody looked at twice. The lobby smelled like recycled air and coffee. The elevator was slow. She hadn't seen him in 3 years. She thought about that in the elevator. 3 years since she'd walked out of her old life and into Dante's orbit, and Caleb had let her go without making it complicated, which was more than most people would have done. He looked older, not worse. Just older, the specific way that men who have been through difficult things and come out the other side tend to look. Something settled in the eyes, something that had been tested and found sufficient. He stood up when she walked in, did not come around the desk, just stood and looked at her and waited. She sat down across from him. I'm pregnant, she said. She had decided on the drive over that she was not going to ease into it. There was no version of easing into it that felt honest. Caleb sat back down slowly. Dante's? He asked. Yes. Does he know? He knows. He asked me to keep it quiet for 6 months while he handles the situation. She kept her voice flat. She had discovered over the past 3 weeks that keeping her voice flat was the only way she could talk about this without the whole thing collapsing on top of her. He's also arranging for me to live at a property outside the city, in the East Wing. Caleb looked at her steadily. Who gets the main house? Bianca Serrano. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a man confirming something he had suspected for longer than was comfortable. What do you need? He said. Those 4 words. That was all. No speech about how she deserved better. No anger on her behalf that she hadn't asked for. No complicated feelings about the situation that she would have to manage on top of her own. Just, what do you need? Elena exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 weeks. I need a job, she said. A real one. Something that's mine. And I need an apartment. Nothing connected to anyone in his world. And I need... She stopped, steadied herself. I need someone who will help me without making me feel like I owe them something for it. Caleb nodded once. I have an opening for a director of operations. We've been running without one for 8 months. It's been a disaster. A brief pause. The salary is competitive. We run a formal hiring process. I can't exempt you from that because it would cause problems with the board. But I can tell you that you're qualified and the process will move quickly if you want it to. I don't want favors. It's not a favor. I need someone who can actually do the job. You can actually do the job. He picked up a pen, set it back down. The apartment. I have a contact. Clean, no connection to any organization. I'll text you the number. She nodded. Her throat felt tight. Caleb? He looked at her. I'm not doing well exactly. She said it carefully. She was not a person who admitted weakness easily, and the admission cost her something. I'm keeping it together, but I'm not... It's a lot. He held her gaze. I know. I just wanted you to know that before we start talking about jobs and logistics, that it's a lot. I know, Elena. His voice was very quiet. You can be not doing well and still move forward at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. She looked at the window behind him. Chicago spread out below in the gray morning light, indifferent and enormous and full of people who had no idea any of this was happening. When can I start? She said. She did not tell Dante she was leaving. This was the decision she thought about most in the days that followed. Not whether to leave, that was already decided, but whether to tell him before she went. She owed him honesty, she thought. They had been together 3 years. That meant something. But then she remembered the study door, slightly open. The reassurance voice. The other situation is being handled. She was the other situation. She packed over 2 days, in increments small enough that nothing looked like packing. A bag here. A box of books framed as donations. Items moved to the office, then to the new apartment, until the sum of her presence in Dante's penthouse was reduced to the minimum that would read as normal. She was good at logistics. She had always been good at logistics. On the third morning, a Thursday, she put the last bag in the trunk of her own car. Not the car his people drove her in, her car, the one registered to her name, and drove to the new apartment. It was smaller than what she'd had. 7th floor, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that got morning light. It smelled like fresh paint. She set her bag down in the middle of the living room. She put her hands on her stomach. "Okay," she said quietly, to the apartment, to the morning, to whatever was listening. "Here we go." She called Dante 3 hours later. She did not tell him where she was. She told him she was taking some space, that she needed time to think, that she would be in touch. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. "Elena, I'm fine. I'm safe. I just need space." "Where are you?" "Somewhere safe." "That is not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." Another silence. Heavier this time. "We need to talk," he said. "In person, not over the phone." "I know, but not today." She hung up. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the kitchen counter and breathed until they stopped. He sent a car the next morning. She watched it from the window. A black SUV parked across the street, engine running, nobody getting out. Just sitting there in the way that expensive, intimidating vehicles sit when they are making a point without making a point. She went downstairs, walked to the driver's window, knocked. The window went down. Marcus, who had driven her dozens of times, looked straight ahead. "Mr. Vescari would like you to come back," Marcus said. "I know," Elena said. "Tell him I said no." "Miss Marlowe, I'm safe, Marcus. I'm healthy. I am not being coerced by anyone. I am making a choice." She kept her voice even, looking at the side of his face because he wouldn't look at her directly. "Please tell him I said no." She went back upstairs. The car sat there for another 40 minutes. Then it left. He sent money 2 days after that. A wire transfer, substantial, arriving in her personal account without a message attached. She stared at it on her phone screen for a moment, calculating what it was supposed to communicate. He thought this was about money. He thought the problem was logistics, resources, the basic material questions of being pregnant and uncertain. That was how his mind worked. Find the practical shape of the problem and solve it with the appropriate practical resource. She transferred it back within the hour with a single message. "I don't need this. Please don't do it again." He called immediately. She let it ring. He called 4 more times over the next 2 hours. She watched her phone light up on the kitchen counter while she ate lunch and read the employee handbook that Caleb's HR director had sent over. And she felt something strange and clarifying happening inside her. A kind of anger that wasn't hot and dramatic but cool and resolute, like metal being tempered. The 5th call she answered. "What is happening?" His voice was controlled. "Barely. I told you I needed space. You returned $30,000. It wasn't mine." "Elena." There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly. Something underneath the anger. Something that, under different circumstances, she might have found moving. "Come back. We'll talk. Whatever you need. You built a house for Bianca." The silence was immediate and complete. She had said it out loud for the first time. She felt the words land between them like something physical. "That is not what that is," Dante said. His voice had changed, tighter now. "Marguerite called me. She was very thorough." Marguerite was not authorized to discuss that. "I'm sure she wasn't. What was she authorized to tell me, Dante? What version of that arrangement were you planning to share?" "It's a security decision, Bianca's family. Your answer is about Bianca's family." She could hear how she sounded, quiet, precise, with no heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than if she'd been yelling. "The woman who is carrying your child has just told you she's leaving, and your first sentence is about Bianca's family." "Elena, I'm starting a new job on Monday. I'm fine. The baby is fine. I will be in touch about the medical appointments. You can be involved in this child's life. That's not something I'm going to withhold from you." She paused. "But I am not coming back." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The afternoon light moved across the floor. At some point, she made tea. At some point, she realized she was crying. Not dramatically, just a slow and steady kind of grief that had nowhere else to go. She let it happen. She didn't try to stop it. Then she wiped her face, rinsed her mug, and went back to the employee handbook. 3 days later, a man named Gio showed up at her building. She knew Gio. He was one of Dante's senior men. Not muscle, exactly, more like a fixer. Someone who resolved ambiguous situations. He was standing in the lobby when she came down on her way to work, and he had the particular stillness of someone who has been told to be calm and is working very hard at it. Miss Marlowe. He held his hands visible, palms slightly out, the universal signal for I am not here to drag you anywhere. Mr. Vescari asked me to check on you. I'm fine. He's concerned about your security. She stopped, turned to look at him fully. Gio, do you understand what that sentence means in this specific situation? He's concerned about my security. I left. He has a man standing in my lobby. Those two things are contradictions. Gio's jaw tightened slightly. He's not trying to... I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to make sure someone who knows things about his operation, his finances, his organizational structure, stays inside a perimeter he controls. And he's framing it as concern for my safety because that framing is harder to argue with. She looked at him steadily. Tell him I said, protection I never asked for is still control. She walked past him. Behind her, she heard him exhale through his nose. She was 3 blocks from the building before she let herself acknowledge that her heart was beating very fast. She told Caleb about the lobby incident that morning over coffee in his office, matter-of-factly, the way she reported things she needed him to know. He listened without interrupting. Do you feel unsafe? He asked. No, not physically. He wouldn't... She stopped. Reconsidered the word wouldn't, applied it against everything she knew about Dante Vescari. He would not hurt me. He doesn't operate that way with people he... Another stop. He wouldn't hurt me. But I feel watched. And I feel watched by someone who has decided that watching me is the same thing as caring about me, which is... She pressed her lips together. It's not the same thing. Caleb nodded. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't promise to handle it or make calls on her behalf. He just acknowledged what she'd said, and then he asked her about the onboarding documentation she'd been reviewing, and the conversation moved forward. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice something you'd forgotten you needed. She went home that evening to her apartment with its morning-light kitchen, and she felt for the first time in several weeks that she might actually be able to do this. Dante Vescari had never in his adult life been ignored. He was not a man who operated in spaces where people ignored him. He was a man who walked into rooms and immediately felt the shift in the air, the subtle recalibration of everyone present. People did not take his calls and then let them go to voicemail. People did not return his money. People did not disappear from his life and then show up 3 days later to calmly inform his security personnel that their presence constituted harassment. He stood at the window of the penthouse, the same window where he had stood the night Elena told him she was pregnant, and he drank the scotch he had poured, and this time he didn't leave it untouched. He drank it slowly, staring at the city, and he thought about Elena Marlowe. He thought about the way she had caught the laundering discrepancy, the way she had, twice in the past year, noticed problems in his operation before his own lieutenants had flagged them. The way she had sat across from him at dinner for 3 years and made him feel, in the specific and private language of ordinary evenings together, like a man rather than an empire. He thought about the study door. He had known she might hear. He had not considered, in that moment, how it would sound. That was a failure of imagination on his part. He recognized that now. He was capable of recognizing his failures. He simply had an unfortunate tendency to recognize them slightly too late. He put down the glass. He called his consigliere, a man named Ferrante, who had been managing the impossible for Dante for 11 years, and who possessed the rare gift of telling him things he didn't want to hear without triggering the instinct to fire the messenger. I need to know where she's working, Dante said. Ferrante was quiet for a moment. She started Monday at a security consulting firm in River North, Rourke Strategic Solutions, Director of Operations. Dante went very still. Rourke. Caleb Rourke. He and Miss Marlowe have a history from before. I know who Caleb Rourke is. He knew exactly who Caleb Rourke was. He had known 3 years ago when Elena mentioned him once, briefly, as an old friend from before. He had filed it away, the way he filed everything, quietly, in a part of his mind he could access when necessary. He had not anticipated that accessing it would feel like this. Is it personal? He asked. His voice was even. He was very good at even. Unknown, Ferrante said. She started Monday. Rourke gave her the director position. Beyond that, find out. Dante. Ferrante's voice shifted slightly. The small shift he made when he was going to say something unwelcome. She's 4 months pregnant and she left of her own accord. Whatever Rourke is or isn't to her, pursuing it this aggressively could... Find out, Dante said again. Ferrante found out. The report came back Thursday. Professional so far, nothing confirmed beyond the job. Elena reported to the office daily. She and Rourke had lunch once, in the building cafeteria, with 2 other employees present. She took public transit or her own car. She had not been seen at his residence. Dante read the report twice. He sat with the specific, unfamiliar sensation of not knowing what to do next. He was a man who always knew what to do next. Strategy was his native language. He thought in outcomes and leverage and the application of appropriate pressure at the appropriate point. He had built an empire out of knowing exactly which move came after which move, and Elena had simply walked out of the game entirely. He couldn't threaten her. He wouldn't. She was carrying his child, and she was the only person in his life he had never had to perform anything for, which was a fact he had understood too late and in the worst possible way. He couldn't buy her back. She had demonstrated that with the wire transfer, which had stung in a way that no financial setback in his professional life had ever stung. He couldn't use protection as leverage because she had correctly identified protection without consent as a form of control. He went to the lakeside estate on Friday. Bianca was in the main house, organizing what appeared to be a significant renovation of the primary suite. She looked up when he walked in, and she smiled. The particular smile she deployed for rooms full of important men, calibrated and precise, and said, "I was wondering when you'd come." "We need to talk about the arrangement," Dante said. Bianca set down the fabric swatch she was holding. "The arrangement has been discussed extensively. Our fathers agreed. You agreed. There are complications. There are always complications." Her voice was smooth. "The question is whether you intend to honor your commitments." Dante looked at her. He thought about Elena in a 7th-floor apartment with morning light windows, returning $30,000 without a second thought. He thought about her voice on the phone, quiet, precise, with no heat in it at all. "The East Wing won't be used," he said. Something moved through Bianca's eyes, quick and cold. "That's a change," she said carefully. "It's a clarification." "And the woman?" "That's not your concern." Bianca was quiet for a moment. She picked up the fabric swatch again, turned it over in her hands. "You know, Dante, the interesting thing about men who treat women as separate categories is that they're always surprised when the categories stop cooperating." She set it down again. "I hope whatever you're planning works out for you." There was something in her voice he didn't examine closely enough. He would regret that later. He drove back to the city. He sat in the back of the car and he thought about Elena, somewhere in River North, building a life he was not part of. Efficiently, methodically, with the same precise intelligence she had spent 3 years applying to his problems. And he felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. He felt afraid. Not of anything specific. Not of the Carrera situation, or the alliance politics, or the complicated leverage game of his professional world. He felt afraid of the specific, ordinary, irreversible truth that he had looked at something valuable, something irreplaceable, and failed to recognize what it was until it was already walking away. His phone buzzed. "Ferrante." He answered. "There's something you need to see," Ferrante said. "What?" "I'd rather show you in person, tonight." Dante looked at the window. The city moved past outside, indifferent and enormous, full of people making choices and living with them. "My office," Dante said. 1 hour. What Ferrante showed him, 63 minutes later, across the mahogany desk in the office, where Dante had conducted more significant decisions than he could count, was a photograph. It was taken from a distance, slightly blurred at the edges. Elena, outside the building in River North where Rourke Strategic Solutions occupied its 14th floor. She was wearing a gray coat he hadn't seen before, and her pregnancy was, he made himself look at it directly, more visible than the last time he had seen her. Nearly 5 months now. Caleb Rourke was beside her. They were not touching. They were standing close in the way people stand close when they are comfortable with each other's presence, talking about something that appeared to be making Elena laugh. Dante could not remember the last time he had made Elena laugh like that. Genuinely. Without the social calibration she applied to rooms full of his associates. He set the photograph down. He was very still. "That's all it is," Ferrante said. I thought you should see it." "Yes," Dante said. "She looks—" Ferrante stopped himself. "She looks fine," Dante said. His voice was very controlled. "She looks like she's doing fine." "Dante, get out, Ferrante." Ferrante got out. Dante sat alone with the photograph on his desk and the scotch he hadn't poured and the specific silence of a man who has just understood something about himself that he cannot unknow and cannot yet figure out what to do with. His phone rang. Bianca. He stared at it until it stopped. Then it rang again. Not Bianca. A number he didn't recognize. He picked up, because in his world unknown numbers were rarely social calls. "Mr. Vescari," said a voice he didn't know. Male. Businesslike. "My name is irrelevant. What's relevant is that there are people inside your organization who believe the next 6 weeks represent an opportunity. I thought you should know that before you spend any more time worrying about things that are outside your building." The line went dead. Dante set the phone down slowly. He looked at the photograph. He looked at his phone. He had spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to reach Elena, to fix what he had broken, to locate the right amount of pressure at the right point that would reverse what she had decided. And while he had been doing that, while his attention had been split, his focus divided, his time consumed by a personal crisis he had created himself, something had been quietly organizing itself inside his organization. He had taken his eye off the board. For the first time in 11 years, Dante Vescari had taken his eye off the board. And someone had moved. He picked up his phone and called Ferrante back. "Get everyone in. Tonight. All of them." A pause. "And find out what's happening with the North Side accounts. Right now. Don't wait." What happened? Dante looked at the photograph one more time. At Elena laughing in the gray coat, 5 months pregnant, standing beside a man who had apparently figured out what Dante had spent 3 years failing to understand. He turned the photograph face down. "Just do it," he said. The crack in his empire had already been there for weeks. He simply hadn't been looking at it. And now, in the 11 years he had spent building the most controlled, deliberate criminal organization in Chicago, Dante Vescari was about to discover that the most dangerous moment in any man's life is not when his enemies find a weakness. It is when he creates one himself and hands the map to everyone who was already waiting for the chance. The North Side accounts were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not the kind of wrong that comes from sloppy bookkeeping or an accountant who'd had a bad quarter. Ferrante laid the printouts across Dante's desk at 11:47 that night, and the numbers told a story that had been running for at least 14 months. Patient, precise, constructed by someone who understood exactly how Dante's financial architecture worked and exactly where to hide things inside it. Dante sat very still in every page. He did not speak for 9 minutes. Ferrante stood across the desk with his hands folded in front of him, the way he always stood when he was delivering information that had the potential to end badly for everyone in the room. How much? Dante said finally. "What we can confirm right now, 4.3 million. But the structure suggests—" Ferrante paused. "The structure suggests this is a fraction." "A fraction of what?" "Of what's been moved. The accounts we can see are clean, too clean, which means the real movement is somewhere we haven't looked yet." Dante turned a page, turned it back. "Who had access to this tier of accounts?" Ferrante's jaw tightened. 3 people, structurally. You, me. He stopped. And Elena. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Dante looked up from the papers for the first time. "Say that carefully," he said. "I'm not saying she did it. I'm saying she had access. Anyone looking at this from the outside—" Ferrante held his gaze. "Anyone investigating this from the outside will identify the same 3 names." Dante pushed back from the desk and stood up. He walked to the window. The window again, always the window, The city spread out below him in the cold November dark. "She didn't do this," he said. "I know." "Then figure out who did, and make sure it's documented before anyone with a badge starts asking questions." "I'm working on it." "But Dante—" Ferrante paused again. He had a particular rhythm to his pauses, a calibration for how much weight a sentence needed before he delivered it. "There's something else." "What?" "The phone call you received tonight. Unknown number." "What about it?" "I traced it. It bounced 3 times, but the origin—" Ferrante moved to the desk, slid a single sheet of paper forward, one name printed in the center. "It came from inside the organization." Dante turned from the window. He walked back to the desk and picked up the paper. The name on it was Marco Vitale, Dante's Northside captain, a man who had been with the Vescari organization for 8 years, who had sat at Dante's table, who had been in the room for conversations that could put every person present in federal prison for the remainder of their natural lives. Dante set the paper down. "Where is he now?" he said. "That's the problem," Ferrante said. "We don't know. They found Marco Vitale's car at 4 in the morning, parked in a lot near the river with the engine cold and the driver's seat empty. No Marco. No phone. No explanation. A man doesn't abandon his car at 4 in the morning unless he's running from something or being carried away from it. By the time dawn came up gray and freezing over the city, Dante had been awake for 22 hours, and the picture was becoming clear in the way that terrible pictures become clear. Slowly, and then all at once, with a brutal completeness that made you wonder how you hadn't seen it earlier. Marco Vitale had been moving money. Not alone. The pattern was too sophisticated for one man operating without infrastructure. He had help inside the organization. At least 2 other people based on the transaction structure Ferrante had mapped across the conference room table in the gray pre-dawn hours. Money from the Northside operations routed through 3 shell accounts that technically existed inside Vescari Holdings but had been quietly redirected over 14 months. And the accounts that money had been flowing toward, Ferrante had found the first one at 3:15 in the morning, and he'd said nothing for a full 60 seconds. And when Dante looked up from the map of transactions and saw Ferrante's face, he knew before he heard it. The accounts pointed toward a company called Serrano Continental Holdings. Bianca's family. Dante sat down. He sat down in the chair at the head of the conference table, and he did not move for a long time. The room was quiet except for the heating system and the sound of Ferrante trying to decide what to say. "How long?" Dante said. "The first transaction we can confirm, 16 months ago. Before the alliance was formalized." "Yes." "So it was not opportunism. It was not a family seeing an opening and deciding to exploit it. The alliance itself, the arrangement Dante had been building, the partnership that had been the strategic foundation of his expansion, the relationship that he had been careful to protect and not to destabilize with the complications of his personal life, had been designed from the beginning as extraction. He had invited Rodrigo Serrano's people into the architecture of his organization. He had handed them the blueprint, and they had been photographing it from the inside for 14 months. He thought about Elena. He thought about the things she had caught, the laundering discrepancy, the subsidiary account problem, the warning signs she had flagged before they became disasters. He thought about the fact that for the past 3 months, the months during which this extraction had accelerated most significantly based on the transaction pattern, she had not been there. She had not been there because he had built a cage and called it protection. He put his forearms on the table and pressed them down hard and breathed. "Get the car," he said. "Where are we going?" "The Lakeside Estate." He drove himself. He sent the car away and drove himself in the flat gray morning light, doing 90 on an empty highway, not speaking, not listening to anything. His hands on the wheel were very steady. He had learned, a long time ago, how to keep his hands steady when everything else was not. The estate sat back from the lake behind iron gates and old trees. He had his own key. He let himself in through the main gate and up the drive, parked in front of the main house, and walked inside without knocking. Bianca was awake. She was sitting in the kitchen in a silk robe drinking coffee at the island, and she looked up when he walked in with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting a visit and has had time to prepare. "You're up early," she said. Serrano Continental Holdings. He said it the way he said everything when the temperature in his chest was below 0. Flat, without inflection, letting the words carry their own weight. Bianca set her coffee cup down. "Sit down, Dante." "I'm not going to sit down." She looked at him steadily. She was, he noticed, not afraid. That told him something. "How much of it was your idea?" he asked. "It was a family decision." "That is not what I asked." She held his gaze. The calibrated smile was gone. What was underneath it was something harder, something that had been there all along and simply not directed at him until now. "You came to my father with a proposal," she said. "A partnership. Resources, influence, protection, all of it contingent on a social arrangement. You wanted access to the Eastern corridors, and you wanted it formalized through marriage. You know what my father said to me when that conversation ended?" She paused. He said, "A man who builds an empire by controlling everything around him eventually leaves the door open because he can't imagine anything getting through it." He said, "The door is Elena Marlowe." Dante's breath moved through him, slow and measured. "So you used her," he said. "We identified a vulnerability. That's not the same thing." Bianca picked up her coffee cup again, a small, deliberate gesture. "She managed your accounts. She caught your problems. She was the thing between your operation and entropy, and you were so focused on containing her socially that you never stopped to think about what happened if she simply, a small lift of one shoulder, stopped. You didn't know she'd leave. No, but we knew you'd eventually do something that made staying difficult for her. You're very consistent, Dante." She said it without cruelty. That was somehow worse. The only question was when. He looked at her for a long moment. Bianca Serrano, 28 years old, elegant and precise, sitting in a kitchen in a robe in a house he had built as a beautiful lie, and she was looking at him like a problem she had already finished solving. "Where's the money?" he said. "Already moved, 3 weeks ago." "Where's your father?" "Not in Chicago." "That will not protect him." "I'm not trying to protect him. I'm telling you a fact." She set the cup down again. "Dante, I want you to hear this clearly. What happened here was business. You treated people like pieces on a board. We treated you the same way. The only difference is that you assumed you were the one running the game." He moved before he fully decided to. 2 steps, his hand flat on the counter between them, close enough that she had to look up to maintain eye contact. Not threatening, not touching her, just occupying the space in a way that had silenced rooms full of dangerous men. Bianca did not flinch, that more than anything told him how this had been constructed. You don't stop flinching at a man like Dante Vescari unless you have spent 14 months operating from a position of certainty. "You have until tonight," he said. "Every account, every transaction record, everything your family moved through my operation, I want the documentation, not as evidence, as a courtesy. Because if I have to find it myself, the way this ends for your family is significantly worse." She held his gaze. "And if I cooperate? Then we are finished, cleanly. And I don't have a conversation with your father about what clean means." A long silence. Bianca nodded once, very slightly. He straightened. He picked up his keys from the counter where he'd set them down without noticing. He walked to the door. "Dante." Her voice stopped him, not because he owed her anything, but because he had always been constitutionally unable to ignore a voice that had something left to say. She was never going to stay. Not after the conversation she overheard. You know that. He didn't turn around. "What she would have done," Bianca continued, "is exactly what she did. She left on her own terms. She built something else. She moved on." A pause. "That frightens you more than any of this." He walked out. The next 3 days were the worst of his professional life. Ferrante worked without sleeping. 2 lieutenants Dante had trusted for years turned out to have been aware of the Serrano extraction and said nothing. Not active participants, but silent ones, which in Dante's world was the same thing. They were removed from the organization with an efficiency that was quiet and permanent. A third man, a soldier named Tess, who had specifically helped route 3 of the transactions, disappeared before they could reach him. Probably Serrano's people. Probably not coming back. The Carrera faction, sensing movement, began making probes from the south. Not an attack, not yet, but the kind of activity that precedes an attack, the way weather changes before a storm. And through all of it, through the sleepless nights and the account forensics and the calculations about how much damage had actually been done and how much could be recovered, Dante kept coming back to the same fact. Elena would have seen this. Not the Serrano connection specifically, that had been carefully hidden, constructed by people who knew how he operated, but the North Side irregularities, the pattern in the subsidiary movements. She had caught smaller inconsistencies than this in the course of an ordinary Thursday afternoon, without anyone asking her to look. She had been the thing between his organization and entropy. He had built a cage and called it protection, and she had left, and then entropy had walked in the open door and helped itself to $4 million and 14 months of strategic intelligence. On the fourth day, Ferrante put a new document on his desk. "This came through a third party," Ferrante said. "A law firm, filed yesterday afternoon." Dante picked it up. It was a formal notification. Elena Marlowe, through counsel, establishing terms for co-parenting communication and medical information sharing. Professional, thorough. The kind of document prepared by someone who had thought about it carefully and anticipated every angle. At the bottom of the document, in the signature line, the name read, Elena Marlowe Rourke. Dante read it twice. He put the document flat on the desk. He pressed one hand down on top of it. Rourke. She had changed her name. He ran the math quickly, involuntarily, because his brain did not stop doing math even when the results were painful. She was 7 months pregnant. She had been gone for nearly 3 months. She and Caleb Rourke had known each other before she met Dante. He thought about the photograph, the gray coat, the genuine laugh. "When?" he said. "The marriage certificate was filed 6 days ago. City Hall." Ferrante paused. "It was a small ceremony, private." Dante stood up. He walked to the window. Below him, Chicago moved in the cold December light, trucks and taxis, and people who had no idea any of this was happening, which was true of everyone's personal catastrophes, wasn't it? The city did not adjust itself for your disasters. His empire was cracked and bleeding money. His North Side captain was missing. 2 of the men he'd trusted for years had turned out to be silent collaborators in an extraction scheme run by a family he'd let inside his walls. The Carrera faction was circling. Bianca was gone. The alliance was destroyed. And Elena, who had spent 3 years seeing every problem before it arrived, who had caught the things he'd missed, who had sat across from him at dinner and made him feel like an ordinary man instead of a machine in an expensive suit, Elena had married someone else. While carrying his child, he put his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Just for a moment, just one moment where he allowed himself to feel the full size of what he had done. Then he straightened. He turned from the window. He looked at Ferrante, who had been with him for 11 years, and who was looking at him now with the careful expression of a man watching something unprecedented. "The Carrera situation," Dante said. "Where does it stand?" "They're testing the North Side perimeter. If we don't respond in the next 48 hours, we respond tonight." He moved to the desk, sat down, pulled the transaction maps toward him. "Call Benedetti. Tell him I need a meeting. Neutral ground." He paused. "And find me a family lawyer." Ferrante blinked. What?" "A family lawyer. Someone who handles custody arrangements. Someone good." He did not look up from the transaction maps. "Whatever this costs me, whatever she has decided about her life, that child is mine. I am not going to be managed out of my own child's life by a legal document I received secondhand." "She's not—" "The document isn't adversarial. She specifically outlined—" "I know what it outlined. I read it." He set the transaction map down. "But I'm not having a relationship with my son mediated by a law firm. I want to talk to her directly." He picked up his pen, put it down. "After I handle Carrera. After I finish this." Ferrante nodded. He moved toward the door. "Ferrante." He stopped. Dante was looking at the desk, not at any specific document, just at the surface of it, the accumulated evidence of an empire that had been quietly undermined while its builder was looking in the wrong direction. "The name on the bottom of that document," Dante said. "Marlowe Rourke." "Yes." "That's—" "She went through with it." "Yes." "While she was 7 months pregnant, she went to City Hall and she—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "She didn't wait. She didn't. She made a decision, and she did it." "She did," Ferrante said carefully. Dante picked up his pen again. "She always was better at execution than anyone I've ever met." He said it quietly, without irony, without the protective layer of contempt that might have made it easier to say. He said it the way you say something that is simply and exactly true, and has been true all along. Get me Benedetti, and get me that lawyer. Ferrante left. Dante looked at the transaction maps. He had spent 11 years building walls around everything that mattered to him. He had built them high and strong and well monitored, and he had believed, in the way that men who have never truly lost anything believe, that the walls were enough. But walls keep people out by keeping things in, and Elena had not needed anyone to break through them. She had simply stopped being willing to live inside them. He picked up his pen. He began to work. Outside, Chicago moved through its cold December afternoon, and somewhere in River North, in an apartment with morning light windows, Elena Marlowe Rourke was building a life he was not part of, efficiently, methodically, without waiting for permission. And the man who had once believed that power meant never having to accept a consequence was sitting alone in the evidence of everything he had refused to see, holding a pen that felt, for the first time in 11 years, insufficiently heavy for the problems in front of him. The Carrera faction hit at 9:17 that night, not a probe, not a test. A coordinated strike across 3 North Side operations simultaneously, timed to the minute, executed with intelligence that could only have come from inside the Vescari organization. Intelligence about shift changes, patrol routes, the specific security gaps that had opened up in the last 3 months, while Dante's attention had been divided. Dante was in the middle of a call with Benedetti when Ferrante came through the door at a speed that meant it was serious. He ended the call. Ferrante said 3 words. 3 words, and Dante was already moving, already reaching for his jacket, already doing the fast and brutal math of a man whose empire was under attack from every direction simultaneously. Betrayed from inside, extracted from above, and now struck from the south by an enemy who had been handed the map. The 3 words Ferrante said were these: they know everything. And Dante Vescari, for the first time in 11 years, had no prepared response. They hit the Wicker Park distribution point first. Dante got the call at 9:19, 2 minutes after Ferrante's 3 words. And the voice on the other end was his man Doyle, who ran the North Side ground operations, and who was not a man who panicked, which made the sound of his breathing significantly worse than panic would have been. They knew the shift change, Doyle said. They were inside before anyone had time to... A sound in the background. Something heavy and final. Doyle. Static. Dante was already moving through the penthouse, jacket on, Ferrante 3 steps behind him. The elevator was too slow. He took the stairs. 17 flights. He didn't feel them. The car was running in the garage. Marcus behind the wheel, already knowing, because Ferrante had texted ahead. Dante got in the back. The door wasn't fully closed when Marcus pulled out. Wicker Park first, Dante said, then wherever the second call comes from, because there will be a second call. The second call came 4 minutes later. The warehouse on Fulton. The third call came 90 seconds after that. A legitimate business. A restaurant supply company that moved certain things alongside restaurant supplies, on the near North Side. 3 simultaneous strikes. Dante sat in the back of the car and listened to the calls come in and did the math and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 23 years old and building this empire from the ground floor with nothing but nerve and intelligence and an absolute refusal to be anyone's afterthought. He felt cornered, not defeated, not yet, but cornered, the specific, adrenaline-spiked clarity of a man who has run out of room to maneuver and now has to fight from exactly where he stands. How many men does Carrera have on the street tonight? He said. Ferrante was on his phone, pulling information from 3 different sources simultaneously. 30 confirmed, possibly 45. And ours? After the Vitale defections and the Serrano, Ferrante paused. Reliable men, fully reliable, maybe 28. 28 against 45 across 3 active strike points, with compromised intelligence and a North Side captain who had vanished with organizational knowledge that was now clearly sitting in Carrera's hands. Marcus made a turn too fast. The city blurred past the windows. Call Benedetti back, Dante said. You just ended the call with him 20 minutes ago. Call him back. Tell him the Carrera situation is active and I need his South Side access tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. He looked out the window. Tell him I'll owe him. Ferrante looked at him. In 11 years, Dante Vescari had never told anyone he'd owe them. Debt, in his world, was leverage surrendered. It was the beginning of a dependency that could be exploited. He had built his entire operation on the principle of never being the one who owed. Ferrante made the call. The Wicker Park location was salvageable. Barely. 2 men down, not dead, injured, which was the specific mercy of a situation that could have been significantly worse. The Carrera crew had taken what they came for and left, which meant this was not a war of annihilation. Not yet. This was a message, a demonstration of access and capability. We know where you are. We know when you're vulnerable. We know what you have, and we can take it. Dante stood in the damaged interior of the distribution point and looked at what the Carrera men had done and thought, this is Vitale's intelligence. These are the gaps that only someone inside would know. The shift timing, the specific room, the fact that the security camera on the east entrance had been cycling on a 6-minute delay for 3 weeks because the maintenance ticket hadn't been processed. He had known about the camera delay. He had mentioned it once, in passing, in a conversation that included Marco Vitale. He breathed through his nose. He looked at the room. He cataloged what he was feeling, the anger, the humiliation, the cold, specific fury of a man who has been outmaneuvered on his own territory. And then he set all of it aside, the way you set aside pain when there's still work to do. What's the status on Fulton? He said. Contained. Our men held the secondary location. Ferrante was checking his phone continuously. Near north is... They're still assessing. Get me a number on the near north. I need to know if they took the inventory or just the space. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered immediately. Mr. Vescari. The voice was the same one from the previous call. Male. Businesslike. Not Carrera himself. Carrera was old and operated through proxies, but someone close. Someone who had been authorized to speak. I hope the evening has been instructive. What do you want? Dante said. A conversation. In person. Tomorrow morning. Tonight. A pause. You're in a hurry. I don't have patience for theater. You want to talk? We talk tonight. My terms. Another pause. Longer. The sound of a man recalibrating. Midnight, the place you'll know. The bar on Huron where you met with the DeLuca people 3 years ago. Come alone. I'll come with one man. Fine. One. The line went dead. Dante put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Ferrante. Midnight on Huron, he said. You're coming. That's a setup, Ferrante said immediately. Maybe. Probably. Probably, Dante agreed. But they want something, or they wouldn't offer a conversation. You don't talk to someone you're planning to eliminate. You also don't walk into a bar at midnight after your operations have been hit on 3 sides in one evening. No, you don't. He picked up his jacket from where he'd set it down. But I don't have 48 hours to establish a counterposition, and Benedetti won't move until morning regardless of what I owe him, and I need to know what Carrera actually wants before I can decide how to respond to it. He looked at Ferrante. So, we go. Ferrante looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has signed up for difficult situations and has made peace with it, but maintains the right to note, for the record, when a situation is particularly difficult. I'll drive, Ferrante said. The bar on Huron was the kind of place that had existed in Chicago for 40 years without changing anything. The same dark wood, the same low lighting, the same smell of old beer and cigarette smoke that had been absorbed into the walls so completely that no amount of time without smoking could remove it. It had been a neutral meeting point for 3 different organizations across 2 decades. Nobody owned it. Everybody used it. There were 4 men inside when Dante and Ferrante walked in at 11:58. 2 were Carrera's people, saw muscle, positioned on opposite sides of the room, not hiding what they were. One was the bartender, who had seen everything that had ever happened in this room and remembered none of it professionally. And one was a man Dante had not expected. He was perhaps 60 years old, well-dressed in an understated way, silver-haired, the kind of man whose physical presence was quiet, but whose eyes had the specific quality of someone who had calculated outcomes at high stakes for a very long time. He was not Carrera. He was, Dante realized as he crossed the room, something that required more careful handling than Carrera. He was Rodrigo Serrano. Dante stopped walking. For 1 second, just one, his body registered what his brain was already processing. Serrano. Here. Tonight. The same night the Carrera strikes had hit. The same night his North Side accounts had been confirmed compromised. The same night, Elena's legal documents had arrived bearing the name Marlowe Rourke. This was not coincidence. Nothing about tonight was coincidence. He crossed the remaining distance and sat down across from Rodrigo Serrano without being invited to, because in Dante's world you did not wait for an invitation from a man who had been robbing you for 14 months. Ferrante remained standing, 3 feet back and to the left. Carrera's muscle did not move. The bartender polished a glass that was already clean. "Rodrigo," Dante said. "Dante." The older man's voice was mild, cultured. A man performing complete comfort in a situation that was, by any reasonable measure, a confrontation. "You look tired. It's been a long evening." "Yes, I imagine it has." Serrano folded his hands on the table. They were steady. "I wanted to speak with you directly. I've always found that cleaner." "Then speak directly." "The eastern corridors," Serrano said. "Your expansion required them. We provided access. The arrangement, the social arrangement, the formalization through my daughter, that was always contingent on performance, on your organization remaining strong enough to make the partnership worthwhile. And the 14 months of extraction from my accounts was, what? A performance evaluation?" Serrano tilted his head slightly. "It was insurance against exactly the kind of instability we've seen in the past quarter." He paused. "Your organization has been in decline. You've been distracted. The North Side operations lost their oversight when you lost your—" Another pause, deliberate. "Your internal resource. The Carrera situation has been allowed to fester. The Vitale problem went undetected for how long?" "How much of Vitale was yours?" Dante said. A small, careful silence. "Vitale identified an opportunity and made a choice," Serrano said. "I won't take credit for another man's initiative. But you facilitated the routing. I provided certain channels that benefited both parties." Dante looked at him. He looked at the hands folded on the table and the careful, mild eyes and the composed expression of a man who had, for 14 months, sat at tables with Dante Vescari and discussed partnership and mutual benefit while systematically draining the organization from the inside. "What do you want?" Dante said. "A renegotiation." Serrano said it simply. "The original arrangement is no longer optimal for either party. Bianca has made her position clear. The marriage proposal is withdrawn, but the eastern corridors represent too significant a mutual interest to simply discard." He unfolded his hands, refolded them. "We want a larger percentage of the North Side distribution, 40%. In exchange, we withdraw support from the Carrera operation. Yes, we've been providing them with certain information. You've worked that out. And the extraction from your account stops, permanently." Dante was quiet. 40% of North Side distribution was not a renegotiation. It was a takeover wearing the costume of a partnership. It was Rodrigo Serrano sitting across a table in a bar on Huron Street and telling Dante Vescari, "We have broken you enough that you will agree to this." It was the endgame. Dante looked at him for a long time. "Give me 24 hours, he said. Serrano considered this. "You have until tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. Dante stood. "One question," he said. Serrano waited. "The intelligence that Carrera used tonight. The shift changes. The camera delay on the east entrance at Wicker Park. That came from Vitale. As I said, Vitale got that from internal communications. Communications that went through a specific set of accounts." Dante kept his voice even. He kept it very, very even. "The same accounts that Elena Marlowe had access to." Serrano's expression did not change. "Are you suggesting," Dante said, "that any of what happened tonight was connected to her?" A silence that lasted 4 seconds. "Miss Marlowe's name has not come up in any of our discussions," Serrano said. "That is not what I asked." "No," Serrano said, finally, cleanly. "She has nothing to do with this. The access point was Vitale. Miss Marlowe has been— she is not involved." Dante nodded once. He walked out. In the car, Ferrante drove and said nothing for 6 blocks, which was his way of giving Dante space to process, and Dante used the 6 blocks staring at the city moving past the dark windows. "He's going to kill you if you don't take the deal," Ferrante said when the 6 blocks were up. "He's going to own me if I take the deal. I know. Neither of those is acceptable." "I know that too. Ferrante signaled a turn. So what do we do? Dante pressed the back of his head against the seat. He looked at the ceiling of the car. He thought about the 28 reliable men he had against Serrano's resources and Carrera's street force. He thought about Benedetti, who had South Side access, and whose help he had promised to owe for. An unprecedented concession that Benedetti would remember for years. He thought about the financial exposure, the accounts that had been drained, the operational intelligence that was now sitting in Serrano's files and Carrera's hands. He thought about Elena. He thought about her with the specific, unsentimental clarity that comes at 2 a.m. after a night that has stripped away every layer of ego and pretension. Not what she represented to him, not the personal loss, not the complicated grief of it. He thought about what she would see if she were looking at this problem, what she would identify, where the leverage actually was. She had always been able to see the thing underneath the thing. He sat up. Benedetti, he said. I called him. He said morning. Call him again. Tell him I'm not asking him to move against Carrera. Tell him I need something different. He paused. Tell him I need the Serrano family's Chicago account structure. Every holding they've registered in this city in the last 5 years. Ferrante glanced at him in the mirror. Benedetti has that? Benedetti has a man at the city assessor's office who has that. He's been sitting on it for 2 years because he didn't have a reason to use it. Dante picked up his phone. I'm giving him a reason. And then? Then I find out what Rodrigo Serrano has in Chicago that he cannot afford to lose. He was dialing. He came to me with a number. I'm going to show him I have a different number, one he hasn't calculated. The phone rang twice. Benedetti picked up, which told Dante something about how closely the South Side was watching tonight's events. It's late, Benedetti said. I know, Dante said. I need the Serrano property records. All of them. I'll have your answer by morning about what I owe you, and I will honor it. A long pause. You really got hit tonight, Benedetti said. Not gloating, just noting. Yes. And you're still moving. I'm always moving. Another pause, then, give me an hour. Dante put the phone down. Ferrante drove. The city moved past in the cold December dark, and Dante Vescari sat in the back of the car with his empire cracked and bleeding around him, and began methodically to find the pressure point. Benedetti's man came through at 3:40 in the morning. The Serrano holdings in Chicago were more extensive than Dante had known, which was itself information, because it meant Rodrigo had been building a Chicago footprint for longer than the alliance had existed. Properties, shell companies, a legitimate hotel venture on Michigan Avenue that Dante was fairly certain had been used to move money between 3 different entities. He sat at his desk with the documents spread out and Ferrante across from him and 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold, and he read everything twice. Then he found it. It was not the hotel. It was not the shell companies. It was a property filing, a warehouse near the rail yards on the southwest side, registered to a company called Continental Meridian LLC, which was 2 layers of corporate structure away from Serrano Continental Holdings, but traceable if you knew what you were looking for. He would not have found it without the assessor's records. Elena would have found it in 40 minutes without the assessor's records, but that was beside the point. He pulled the filing, read the address, read the registration date, 8 months ago, filed 3 months after the extraction from his accounts had begun accelerating. What's at this address? He said. Ferrante looked at the filing, made a call, waited. The answer came back in 11 minutes. The warehouse was active, staffed, operating on a schedule that did not correspond to any legitimate business filing. 3 vehicles registered to Continental Meridian had been ticketed for overnight parking in the surrounding blocks on 6 separate occasions in the past 4 months. That, Dante said, is where the extracted money went. Not into Serrano's primary accounts. Those would have been too visible, too traceable, if anyone started looking. Into a Chicago-based operation that Rodrigo had been building quietly, using Vescari money, using Vescari intelligence, under the cover of the alliance that was supposed to benefit both parties. Rodrigo Serrano had not been stealing from Dante. He had been capitalizing him, building a competing operation in Dante's own city on Dante's money, using intelligence gathered from inside Dante's organization. And then, when the operation was sufficiently built, coming to the table with a renegotiation offer designed to fold the Vescari Northside distribution directly into it, 40%. That was the opening number. The endgame number was everything. Dante looked at the warehouse address. He looked at the clock. 4:12 in the morning. He had until 6 in the evening. Wake everyone up, he said. Everyone we have. I need 12 men at this address by 5:30. I need them quiet, and I need them ready. He stood. And I need Vitale. Ferrante looked up sharply. We don't have Vitale. Find him. Dante moved toward the door. Serrano needed him to vanish so he couldn't talk to us, which means Serrano is holding him somewhere. And if Serrano is holding him somewhere, it's somewhere he controls in this city. He looked at Ferrante. Check the warehouse. Check everything around it. Marco Vitale is either a prisoner or a liability, and either way, he's somewhere Rodrigo can see him. He picked up his jacket. Where are you going? Ferrante said. Dante stopped. He stood with his hand on the doorframe, and he thought about what he was going to say before he said it, which was not something he usually bothered to do. I'm going to see Elena, he said. Ferrante was very still. Now. It's 4 in the morning. She's 7 months pregnant, and her husband is probably... I know what time it is. Dante's voice was quiet, completely controlled. I know exactly what I'm walking into. I'm going anyway. He looked at the floor for a moment. She needs to know what's happening, not because I need something from her, because she was in those accounts. Her name is on access logs that Serrano's people have now. If this goes sideways tonight, if the operation at the warehouse goes wrong, her name is associated with those accounts, and I need her to have documentation that protects her. He looked at Ferrante. That's why I'm going. Ferrante held his gaze for a moment. That's part of why you're going, Ferrante said. Dante said nothing. He left. The apartment building in Lincoln Park was quiet at 4:20 in the morning, the lobby empty, the elevator ascending with the slow patience of a machine that had no investment in anyone's urgency. Dante stood in it and watched the numbers change and kept his hands still and breathed. He had not been here before. He had the address from Ferrante's early reports, filed back when he was still trying to determine where Elena had gone, before he understood that knowing where she was did not give him any claim on the information. 7th floor. He stood at the door for a moment. He knocked. Silence. Then movement, cautious, measured, the sound of someone who does not open doors at 4 in the morning without first determining what's on the other side of them. Who is it? A man's voice. Caleb Rourke. Awake, alert, no sleep in it. Dante Vescari. A pause that lasted 4 full seconds. The door opened. Caleb Rourke was 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a gray t-shirt and the specific expression of a man who is in the presence of a significant threat and is not going to signal that it affects him. He filled the doorframe without trying to. His eyes moved over Dante with a professional speed that came from years of security work, cataloging, assessing, making rapid determinations. They were approximately the same age. They looked at each other for a moment. She's asleep, Caleb said. I know, I need to wake her. Dante kept his voice level. It's not personal. It's a security matter that directly involves her. Everything with you involves her. This is different. Her name is on account access logs that are now in the hands of people who may use them as leverage or evidence. She needs to know that tonight, before anything else happens. He held Caleb's gaze. I'm not here for anything else. I'm telling you that directly. Caleb looked at him for another moment. Reading him, the way people who are trained to read threats read them. Then he stepped back from the door. Dante walked in. The apartment was small and warm and smelled like coffee and something baking. Bread, maybe, from earlier in the day. There were books stacked beside the couch and shoes by the door and a baby monitor on the kitchen counter that Dante's eyes moved to involuntarily before he made himself look away. Not yet. That was not yet. Elena came out of the hallway in a dark green robe, her hair loose, her face carrying the specific look of a person dragged from deep sleep. Her pregnancy was he had seen the photograph, but the photograph had not fully prepared him for the reality of standing in the same room with her. She was 8 days from her due date. She looked exhausted and solid and completely unintimidated by his presence in her hallway at 4 in the morning. She looked at him. What happened? She said. Not why are you here? Not how did you find me? She read his face the same way she had always read everything, and she went straight to the operative question. Serrano, he said, the North Side accounts. Your name is on the access logs, and those logs are now in Rodrigo Serrano's files. He watched her face. I need you to have documentation. Your employment records, the shell company filings, everything that establishes your role as a contracted consultant with independent access. If anyone comes to you with questions about those accounts, I have documentation, she said. I've had it for 3 months. How thorough. Dante. Her voice was patient, not warm, not cold, just patient, the way you are with someone who is smart enough to know better but is underestimating you anyway. I spent 3 years managing your accounts. When I left, the first thing I did was document every access, every transaction I touched, every authorization. I have 3 copies. My lawyer has one. I am not going to be used as a lever against you, and I was not going to wait for you to think of protecting me before I protected myself. He looked at her. Of course. Of course she had. Okay, he said. She crossed her arms over her stomach. Is that everything? It was not everything. He knew it was not everything, and she knew it was not everything. And Caleb Rourke, who was standing 6 feet away with his arms at his sides and his full attention on Dante, knew it was not everything. Dante looked at her. He looked at Elena Marlowe Rourke standing in her own hallway at 4 a.m, 8 days from delivering his child, in an apartment that smelled like home in a way his penthouse never had. And he felt the full weight of every choice he had made settle onto him with a completeness that no amount of empire could distribute. The baby, he said, is the baby. Fine. We're both fine. And you're... Dante. Her voice changed slightly, still patient. But underneath the patience, something more tired than anger, something that had moved past anger into a place he couldn't quite reach. I need to go back to sleep. I'm 8 days out and I need rest. He nodded. He turned toward the door. Then he stopped. He turned back. He looked at her directly, and he did not perform anything. Not confidence, not control, not the armored expression he wore in rooms full of dangerous men. He just looked at her the way you look at someone when the performance has become beside the point. I'm going to handle the Serrano situation tonight, he said. I want you to know that. Not because you need to know it, but because if something goes wrong, I want... He stopped. He tried again. I want you to know I was handling it. That I understood at the end what I'd allowed to happen. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Her face did not soften. It did not harden either. It was just present. Real. The face of a woman who had loved him for 3 years and left him and built something else, and was standing in the evidence of it at 4 a.m, looking at the man who had made all of it necessary. Don't get killed, she said. He almost smiled. That's the plan. He nodded to Caleb Rourke. Caleb nodded back. A minimal acknowledgement that contained no warmth but no hostility either. 2 men in a hallway making a temporary, wordless peace over something that was much larger than either of them. Dante walked out. The elevator descended. He stood in it with his hands still and his breathing measured, and he thought, 6 o'clock. Rodrigo Serrano's deadline. The warehouse on the southwest side. 12 men. Marco Vitale. Somewhere inside the perimeter. He thought about what Elena had said. I documented every access, every transaction I touched, every authorization. I have 3 copies. She had been protecting herself since the day she left. Since before the day she left, probably. She had seen this coming, maybe not the specific shape of it, but the general direction. She had understood that proximity to Dante Vescari left marks that couldn't always be controlled, and she had managed the risk the same way she managed every risk, carefully, in advance, without waiting for someone else to think of it. He walked out of the building into the cold December dark. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was empty. 4:31 in the morning. Somewhere above him, on the 7th floor, Elena was going back to sleep. Caleb Rourke was probably standing at the window, watching him. The baby monitor on the kitchen counter was doing whatever baby monitors did. He walked to his car. He had until 6 o'clock. He had 12 men and Benedetti's intelligence and one piece of leverage that Rodrigo Serrano did not know he had. He pulled into traffic. He was not the man who had stood at the window 3 months ago, staring at the city, paralyzed by the specific, unfamiliar experience of not knowing what move came next. He had found the move. He had found it the same way he found every move, by stripping away everything that wasn't the problem and looking directly at what was. The warehouse. The accounts. The documentation that would expose what Serrano had built with Vescari money. The evidence that turned Rodrigo's renegotiation from a position of strength into a liability he could not afford to have examined. Dante drove. At 5:28, his phone buzzed. Ferrante. We found Vitale. The warehouse? Adjacent property. A loading facility 2 blocks east. He's alive. A pause. Not in great shape, but alive. Can he talk? Give him an hour. He has 20 minutes. Dante checked the clock on the dash. I need his account authorizations. Anything he signed off on that routes back to the Serrano transfers. I need his testimony documented before 6 o'clock. I'll make it work. And Ferrante. Yeah. When this is done, Dante paused. He watched the city move past, December and dark and indifferent. I want to restructure the account access, going forward, tighter authorization chains, better internal monitoring. He paused again. I want to rebuild it the way Elena had it before things changed, the way she had it organized. A silence. She had it organized well, Ferrante said. She had it organized perfectly, Dante said. I want it back the way she had it. He ended the call. 5:32. 28 minutes until his men were in position at the warehouse. 90 minutes until Rodrigo Serrano expected an answer. The city spread out ahead of him, cold and gray in the pre-dawn, and Dante Vescari drove toward the last fight he had the resources to win, holding in his mind the clear and terrible knowledge that winning it would not give him back the thing he had lost. But it would give him what he had left, and what he had left was still worth fighting for. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He answered, You visited her. Not Serrano. A different voice. One of Serrano's men, the one who had been watching the Lincoln Park building. Mr. Serrano considers that a provocation. Dante's hand tightened on the wheel, once, then released. Tell Mr. Serrano, Dante said, that I visited the mother of my child. Tell him that has nothing to do with our business. A pause. And tell him I will have an answer for him at 6 o'clock. His voice was completely even. But tell him also, and I want you to use these exact words, that I suggest he spend the next hour accounting for every property he holds in this city, because the number he gives me at 6 o'clock needs to be a number he can still afford. He ended the call. Ahead of him, the southwest side emerged in the gray pre-dawn light, industrial and cold, warehouses and rail yards and the specific quiet of a part of the city that is never entirely asleep. He could see the warehouse from 2 blocks away. He pulled over. He sat for a moment with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and the cold pressing against the windows. He thought about Elena saying, "Don't get killed." He thought about Milo, the name he had not yet been told, but that Ferrante had found in a medical filing. Milo Marlowe, his son, not yet born, 8 days away. And he thought about the specific shape of a future that was going to require him to be someone he had not yet become. Not the man who treated people as pieces on a board. Not the man who believed possessing something meant he deserved to keep it. Something else. Something he was going to have to build from what remained after tonight. He put the car in park. He got out. The cold hit him immediately. December, 4:59 in the morning, the wind off the lake finding every gap. He walked toward the warehouse with his hands loose at his sides and his breathing steady and his mind completely, absolutely clear. Behind him, from 3 different directions, his 12 men were moving into position. And ahead of him, behind the corrugated metal walls of a building registered to Continental Meridian LLC, was everything Rodrigo Serrano had spent 14 months building on stolen ground. Dante reached the door. He put his hand on it. He pushed it open and walked into the dark. The warehouse was bigger on the inside than it looked from the street. That was the first thing Dante registered. The scale of it, the careful organization of the interior space, the rows of shelving that held inventory he recognized the shape of even in the dim industrial lighting. Not product, not contraband. Documentation. Physical files, binders, hard drives, and labeled cases, the kind of meticulous paper trail that a careful man builds when he is constructing something he intends to be permanent. Rodrigo Serrano had not been stealing from Dante Vescari. He had been building a replacement. Dante stood just inside the door and let his eyes adjust and looked at what 14 months of extracted money and stolen intelligence had constructed, and he felt something that was not quite rage and not quite admiration, but lived in the territory between them. This had taken planning, real planning, the kind that required patience and discipline and a long view of outcomes. He could respect the craft even while he dismantled it. There were two men inside, not expecting him clearly, because the door had not been guarded, which meant Serrano had not yet received the message Dante had sent through his proxy, or had received it and underestimated what it meant. The two men registered his presence at the same moment, from opposite ends of the warehouse, and both of them moved toward their jackets in the specific way that men move when their jackets contain something they need quickly. They did not get there. Ferrante came through the side entrance 2 seconds after Dante came through the front, and 4 of the 12 men came through the loading dock at the back, and the remaining 8 held the perimeter outside, and the 2 men inside the warehouse made the rapid calculation that was available to them and arrived at the correct answer. They put their hands up. "Good," Dante said. He walked forward into the warehouse. "Sit down." They sat. He walked the rows of shelving slowly, reading labels, pulling binders at random, and opening them. Financial records, account structures, a corporate map of Continental Meridian's holdings that was far more detailed than anything the public filing records had shown, property acquisition, staffing records, a distribution plan for the north side that was— He stopped walking, holding the binder open, a direct operational replica of the Vescari distribution network, built to absorb it. Not compete with it, absorb it. The 40% renegotiation offer had never been an opening position. It was a final formality before the whole thing folded into Serrano control. By spring, if Dante had taken the deal, there would have been no Vescari Northside operation. There would have been Serrano's operation, running on Vescari infrastructure, staffed by Vescari people who had been quietly transferred their loyalty through the mechanism of money and fear over the preceding year. He closed the binder. He handed it to Ferrante without looking at him. "Document everything," he said. "I want photographs of every shelf, every file. I want the hard drives copied on site before we move anything." He walked to the center of the warehouse. "And I want Rodrigo Serrano on the phone in 20 minutes. "It's 5:15 in the morning," Ferrante said. "I know what time it is." Marco Vitale looked like a man who had spent several days being convinced to cooperate with people who had strong feelings about the outcome of the cooperation. He was sitting in a folding chair in the adjacent loading facility when Dante's men brought him over, and his face had the specific quality of someone who has made a series of decisions that he understood, in retrospect, were bad, and who has had a great deal of time to sit with that understanding. He looked at Dante, and he did not look away. Dante gave him credit for that. "Marco," Dante said. "Dante." His voice was rough. He hadn't had water in a while. Ferrante put a bottle of water on the floor beside the chair. Vitale looked at it, picked it up, drank. Dante waited. "They told me you were finished," Vitale said when he'd lowered the bottle. "That the Serrano deal was already closed. That by spring it wouldn't matter who I'd been loyal to because there wouldn't be a Vescari organization to be loyal to." "And you believe them?" "I believe the math." He looked at the water bottle. "The extraction was already done. The Carrera connection was in place. You were distracted. Everyone could see you were distracted." He paused. "I thought I was getting ahead of something inevitable." "You were getting ahead of something preventable," Dante said. "Those are different things." Vitale said nothing. "I need your account authorizations. Every transaction you signed off on that roots back to the Serrano transfers. I need a written statement, I need it detailed, and I need it in the next 30 minutes. Dante crouched down so they were at eye level. He looked at the man across from him, a man he had trusted for 8 years, a man who had sat at his table and eaten his food and then quietly helped drain the organization from the inside. He looked at him without the anger he'd expected to feel. He felt something flatter than anger, something more like exhaustion. "Do this and you walk away. Not clean. You don't get clean, but you walk." "And if I don't?" "Then the people who had you in that room for several days were amateurs compared to what happens next." He said it evenly, without theater. It was simply true, and they both knew it was true, and pretending otherwise would have been an insult to both of them. "But I don't want that outcome, Marco. It's inefficient, and it doesn't solve the actual problem." Vitale looked at him. You know what the actual problem is? Dante said. The actual problem is that I stopped paying attention to the right things. That's on me. He stood. So write the statement and we're done. Vitale wrote the statement. It took 22 minutes. It was thorough. Rodrigo Serrano answered his phone on the fourth ring. He sounded awake. He had probably been awake for hours. A man running an operation this complex does not sleep well in the final phase. You're early, Serrano said. I'm at Continental Meridian's warehouse on the southwest side, Dante said. I have 12 men, your complete documentation, photographs of every file, copied hard drives, and a written statement from Marco Vitale regarding the account routing. He paused. The two men who are here are unharmed. They're going to stay that way as long as the next part of this conversation goes the way I need it to go. A silence. It was a different quality of silence than the one at the bar on Huron. That one had been the silence of a man managing a situation. This one was the silence of a man recalculating from new information. What do you want? Serrano said. I want the original money back. All of it, not the 4.3 million we confirmed. All of it, because I think the real number is closer to 7, and I think you know exactly what it is. I want the Carrera support withdrawn today, formally, with whatever communication makes that clear to their people. I want Continental Meridian's Chicago holdings transferred to a name I provide within 30 days. Dante walked slowly along the warehouse shelving as he spoke, trailing his fingers along the edges of binders. And I want your word, given in a format that is useful to me if you break it, that the Serrano family does not operate in Chicago for the next 5 years. That is not a negotiation, Serrano said. That is a surrender. Yes, Dante said. It is. He stopped walking. You built something significant here. I can see that. What you constructed is genuinely impressive, but you built it on my ground with my money and my intelligence, and I have all of it documented, and I have the man who signed the transfers sitting here with a written statement, and if I have to use that documentation, the consequences for your family's operations extend well beyond Chicago. He paused. Or you give me what I asked for, and this is finished tonight, cleanly. Another silence, longer this time. Dante waited. He was good at waiting. He had learned patience in the same years he'd learned everything else, through necessity and repetition and the understanding that the person who can hold silence the longest usually wins the conversation. The money, Serrano said finally. I'll need 48 hours. You have 24. Dante, 24 hours, Rodrigo. He kept his voice measured. You have the resources. The 48-hour request is a negotiating reflex. We're past that. A long exhale on the other end. 24 hours, Serrano said. The Carrera communication happens today, before noon. Yes. And your word on Chicago. A pause. You have it. Good. Dante moved toward the warehouse door. I'll be in touch about the transfer documents. He stopped. One more thing. The thing he had been holding for last. Rodrigo, my son is 8 days from being born. Whatever else has happened between us, that child is not part of this business and never will be. I want to be very clear about that boundary. Serrano's voice, when it came, was quieter. That was never the intent. I know. I'm making sure it stays that way. He ended the call. He stood in the doorway of the warehouse in the cold December pre-dawn, and he looked at the sky, which was beginning to move from black toward the specific dark blue that comes before gray, and he breathed the cold air in and held it and let it out. Ferrante appeared beside him. Well? Ferrante said. He'll pay. You're sure? He has too much elsewhere to risk this becoming public. The documentation we have destroys the legitimate face of his operation. He's a businessman first. He'll pay. Dante looked at the sky. Start the documentation transfer. I want everything off-site before 7. And Benedetti? I'll call him this morning. He gets the southwest side property. Whatever Continental Meridian was building down there, it goes to Benedetti. That's what I owe him. He looked at Ferrante. Make sure he understands it's a clean transfer. Nothing attached. Ferrante nodded. He started to move back inside. Ferrante. He stopped. You've been with me 11 years, Dante said. 11 years and 4 months, Ferrante said. What I built... Dante looked at the warehouse, at the evidence of what his inattention had allowed. It got smaller tonight. What's left is real, but it's smaller. Smaller can be solid, Ferrante said. Solid lasts longer than big. Dante looked at him for a moment. Go finish the documentation, he said. Ferrante went. The sun came up while they were still working. By 8 o'clock, the warehouse had been thoroughly documented and the files transferred. By 9, Ferrante had confirmation from Carrera's South Side contact that the withdrawal signal had been sent. Not a call, a specific absence of communication, which was how these things were done in a world that ran on careful ambiguity. By 10, Dante was back at his desk with coffee. He actually drank this time, and a city that was still standing outside his window. He sat for a while. The penthouse was quiet. It had always been quiet, but the quiet felt different now. Not the quiet of a controlled environment, but the quiet of a space that had been emptied of something it needed. He looked at the kitchen, at the small desk in the corner that Elena had claimed as her workspace, and the desk was still there, exactly as she'd left it, because he had not moved it, or cleared it, or acknowledged in any practical way that she was gone. He looked at the desk for a long time. Then he called a number he'd had for 3 months and used exactly once. Caleb Rourke answered on the second ring. It's Vescari, Dante said. I know. No hostility, no warmth either, just a factual acknowledgement of a call that had been anticipated. The Serrano situation is resolved. Elena's name will not come up in anything going forward. I wanted you to know that. She told me about the documentation she has. It won't be needed, but she should keep it anyway. He paused. How is she? A silence. She had a hard night, Caleb said. She doesn't sleep well at 8 days out. I don't think that's related to anything specific. No, Dante agreed. I don't think it is either. Another pause. The two men sat with the specific awkwardness of a situation that had no established protocol, because the situation was unusual enough that no protocol existed. Rourke, Dante said. Yeah. You're good to her. He said it because it was true and because it needed to be said, not because saying it was easy. I can see that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I try to be. It's more than trying. What I saw this morning, the way she was in that apartment, that's not fear. That's not someone making the best of a bad situation. He stopped. He had not intended to say this much, but it was 4 months of holding something that had no other outlet, and Caleb Rourke was, improbably, the only person it made sense to say it to. She looks like herself, the self she was before. He stopped again. Before things got complicated. Before you made them complicated, Caleb said. Not cruel, just accurate. Yes, Dante said. Before I made them complicated. A long silence. She's going to need to sleep today, Caleb said finally. But she'll be in touch about the co-parenting terms when she's ready. The lawyer has a draft. I'll wait for her timeline. Okay. Rourke, take care of my son. Another silence, longer than the others. He's going to be taken care of, Caleb said. You have my word on that. Dante ended the call. He sat at his desk and he did not move for a while. Elena Marlowe came into the world at 6:42 in the morning on December 19th, 8 days after the warehouse, 7 days after the Serrano money transfer cleared into Vescari accounts, 6 days after Ferrante confirmed the Carrera withdrawal was complete. Dante received the notification through the family lawyer. A text, 8 words, baby born, mother and son healthy. Elena. He read it sitting in his car in the parking structure below the penthouse, which was where he'd been when the phone buzzed, just back from a morning meeting with Benedetti that had run long. He read it 3 times. He sat with it for a while. Then he sent back 2 words. Thank you. He didn't know if she would understand everything those 2 words meant. He suspected she might. He waited 3 days before going to the hospital. Not because he was told to, Elena had said, through the lawyer, that he could visit during the 2nd or 3rd day at her discretion. He waited 3 days because he needed 3 days to figure out who he was going to be when he walked into that room. He had spent the intervening time doing something he had not done in 11 years of running an organization, asking himself honest questions and waiting for honest answers. What did he want? Not rhetorically, not in the way that powerful men ask themselves what they want and then confirm the answer they already had before they asked, genuinely. What did Dante Vescari want? Now that the empire had been cracked and rebuilt into something smaller and more solid, now that the false alliance was gone. Now that the man he had been before was standing in a hospital parking structure at 7 in the morning, asking himself something real, he wanted his son. He wanted, and this was the harder thing, the thing he had to look at directly to understand. He wanted to be the kind of father who deserved access to his son. Not through legal arrangements, not through the mechanism of his name and his money and the reflexive deference that surrounded him in every room he'd ever entered, through behavior, through consistency, through proving, in the ordinary repetitive language of showing up, that he was someone worth trusting with a small person who hadn't asked to be born into this particular story. That was what he wanted. The other thing, Elena, he had looked at that too. He had looked at it honestly, in the way you look at something you've broken and understand cannot be repaired, only accepted. She was not coming back. He knew that. He had known it since she'd raised her wedding ring in the parking lot of the hospital 3 months ago in his imagination, which was where he'd rehearsed that conversation 100 times before it happened. He had known it when he'd seen her in the apartment at 4 in the morning, standing in the evidence of a life she'd built without him, looking at him with patient finality. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she had made herself very clear. He walked into the hospital. Security stopped him at the maternity ward entrance, which, he had anticipated this, and he had made himself sit with the anticipation rather than preparing a way around it. He had, in 4 days, become a man who was working on sitting with things rather than immediately applying pressure to them. He gave his name. Security made a call. He waited. 3 minutes later, a nurse came and let him through. The room was at the end of a quiet corridor. The door was partially open. He knocked on the frame. "Come in," Elena said. He pushed the door open. She was sitting up in the hospital bed wearing a pale blue shirt that was not a hospital gown, her hair pulled back, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who has done something enormous and is running on the residual energy of it. Beside her, in a clear plastic bassinet, was a small person wrapped in a striped hospital blanket. Caleb was in the chair beside the bed. He looked up when Dante came in, and he stood. Not as a challenge, just as a man standing in the presence of a moment that warranted it. Dante looked at Elena first. "How are you?" he said. "Tired." "Good." She shifted slightly. "Caleb, can you give us a few minutes?" Caleb looked at her. She nodded slightly. He nodded back, picked up his coffee from the windowsill, and moved past Dante toward the door. "I'll be right outside," he said. Not to Dante. To Elena. "I know," she said. The door closed behind him. Dante stood in the middle of the room and looked at his son. Milo Marlowe was 6 days old and approximately the size of a loaf of bread, and had, from what Dante could see, the slightly red and crumpled look of someone who had recently arrived somewhere disorienting and was taking stock of it. He was not crying. He was awake. Dark eyes that were still finding focus, moving at the light from the window. Dante did not move toward the bassinet. He waited. "You can look," Elena said. He walked to the bassinet. He stood over it and looked at his son. He had not been prepared for what this would feel like. He had thought he was prepared. He had been processing the reality of it for 9 months, or at least the version of processing that Dante Vescari was capable of, which involved logic and contingency planning and the careful management of his own reactions. None of that had been preparation for this. This was something that didn't have a category in his experience. He stood there and he looked at Milo Marlowe, 6 days old, taking stock of the world, and he felt something shift in him that was not like any previous shift. Not the crack in his certainty, not the recalibration of his strategy, not the adjustment of his position. Something that went deeper than any of those things, and couldn't be managed or directed or applied to a problem. "He has your nose," Elena said. Dante looked at her. She was watching him watch the baby, and her expression was, he tried to read it the way he had always read her face, and what he found was complicated and real and not reducible to a single thing. There was grief in it. There was something that might have been tenderness, the residue of 3 years that didn't just evaporate. There was exhaustion and resolution, and the quiet certainty of a woman who has made her decisions and is at peace with them. There was no opening. He was not looking for one. He simply saw her clearly, which was something he had not always done. "Can I hold him?" Dante asked. Elena looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, not withholding, not punishing, just looking with the specific honesty of someone deciding something real. "Not today," she said. He nodded. He had expected this, and he accepted it without pressure, which was itself, he recognized, a new thing. The old version of him would have produced the argument, would have found the angle, would have applied the particular pressure that moved immovable things, because he had always believed that immovable things were simply things where the right pressure hadn't been found yet. He was learning that some things were not pressure problems. Okay, he said. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room, not Caleb's chair, a different one, and he sat down, not close enough to crowd her, and he looked at his son in the bassinet. His name, he said, Milo. She watched his face. Milo Marlowe. Oh, not Vescari. No. She said it without apology and without aggression, just a fact, offered directly. He sat with it. Marlowe is a good name, he said finally. She looked at him, slightly surprised. It is, he said. It's a strong name. She was quiet for a moment. The co-parenting terms are drafted. Your lawyer has the document. I know. I've read it. He glanced at her. It's fair. I tried to make it fair. You did. He looked back at Milo. I want to be in his life, Elena. Not in the way I've been in other things. Not as a presence that has to be managed or accommodated. I want to earn it. He paused. I understand that's not something I can demand. I understand the difference now. Understanding the difference is new, she said. Yes, it is. He didn't defend himself. There was nothing to defend. I'm aware of that. She adjusted her position against the pillows. She looked at the window, then back at the bassinet, then at him. You handled the Serrano situation, she said. Yes. And Vitale? Gone. Not dead, just elsewhere. He looked at his hands. The organization is smaller than it was, cleaner. He paused. I rebuilt the account monitoring structure, the way you had it. She looked at him sharply. The oversight layers, the authorization chains, the flagging system you set up in year 2. He met her eyes. I had Ferrante reconstruct it from the operational records. It took him 4 days. A pause. He said it was elegant. I already knew that. I hadn't told you when it was worth telling you. Elena was quiet. I'm not saying that to... He stopped. I'm not saying it as a negotiation. I'm telling you because it's true and because I owe you the acknowledgement of what you built and what it was worth. He looked back at Milo. You deserve to know that someone finally said it out loud. She was quiet for a long time. I know what I built, she said finally. I've always known. I know you have. The room held the specific quiet of a hospital morning. The sounds of the corridor beyond the door, the soft mechanical beep of something monitoring something, the distant movement of a place that was organized around transition and beginning. Milo made a small sound, not a cry. Something between contentment and inquiry. Elena reached automatically into the bassinet and adjusted his blanket with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for 6 days and had already developed the reflexive fluency of it. Dante watched her hands. You're good at it, he said quietly. It's been 6 days. You're already good at it. She looked at Milo for a moment. Something moved through her face that was private and deep and not directed at anyone else in the room. The specific expression of a person looking at something they didn't fully know they were capable of loving until it existed. He's pretty good too, she said. He stayed for 22 minutes. He didn't know that was exactly how long it was until he checked his phone in the elevator on the way down and saw the time and found himself thinking that 22 minutes was probably the correct amount. Not too long, not performatively brief, just present and then not, in the rhythm that people who are building trust have to establish before the rhythm becomes natural. In the lobby, Caleb Rourke was sitting in one of the waiting chairs, coffee in hand, doing nothing in particular. He looked up when Dante came through. They looked at each other for a moment. Dante crossed the lobby. He stopped 3 feet from Caleb and looked at him. This man who had offered Elena a choice when Dante had offered her a cage, who had let her build something rather than building it around her, who was sitting in a hospital lobby at 7 in the morning, having given his wife space to have a difficult conversation with the man she'd left. I'm not going to be a problem, Dante said. Caleb met his eyes. I know. The co-parenting terms are fair. I'll work within them. Good. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. She worked hard on those terms. She wanted them to be something that would actually work long term. It shows. A silence. Not hostile, just two men sitting with the specific awkward honesty of a situation that had no established roadmap. He's healthy? Caleb said. Dante looked at him. Milo, Caleb said. I couldn't see much from the chair. Dante thought about the small person in the bassinet, taking stock of the world with dark, unfocused eyes. Yes, he looks good. He paused. He looks like he's thinking about something important. The corner of Caleb's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. Elena says he makes that face, Caleb said. The thinking face. I've seen it before, Dante said. They both knew whose face he meant. Caleb nodded. I'll let you get back up there, Dante said. He walked out of the hospital into the December morning. 1 year later. The city was in the transition between fall and winter, the specific few days when Chicago can't decide what season it is. Cold enough for coats, but not yet cold enough for the particular resignation that comes with real December. Dante drove himself now. Had been driving himself for most of the year. He had kept Marcus on staff but had stopped using the car service for ordinary days, which surprised people who knew him and which he didn't particularly explain. He pulled up to the address in Lincoln Park at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. The building had a small courtyard. He buzzed. Elena's voice came through the intercom. Come up. He took the elevator to the 7th floor. The door to the apartment was already open a few inches. He pushed it open. The apartment was bigger than he remembered. They had moved to a larger unit in the same building around Milo's 6th month. He knew from the legal correspondence. The living room had the specific organized chaos of a home with an infant graduating into toddlerhood, a playmat in the corner, a basket of toys beside the couch, a small pair of shoes by the door that were comically small even by infant standards. Elena was in the kitchen, and Milo was on the living room floor. Dante stopped. His son was standing, not steadily, not with any particular confidence. I was gripping the edge of the coffee table with both hands, and his legs were doing the particular trembling effort of a person operating at the outer edge of their physical capability, and his face had the expression of someone who has decided to do something very difficult and is partway through and is not sure about the decision anymore. He looked up when Dante came in. Dark eyes, Elena's eye shape, Dante's something that was neither of them and entirely its own. Milo at 12 months was specific and distinct and already, impossibly, a person who had opinions about things. He stared at Dante with the direct assessment of someone who had been introduced to this particular visitor 8 or 9 times now, and was still maintaining the right to remain undecided about him. Hey buddy, Dante said. Milo stared. You're standing, Dante said. Milo appeared to consider this as information. Elena came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Dante without ceremony. The particular ease of a handoff between people who have been having Saturday morning exchanges for a year and have settled into the rhythm of them. He started yesterday, she said. He's been practicing all morning. How far has he gotten? He let go once, for about 2 seconds. She sat on the couch, pulling her feet up underneath her, watching Milo with the relaxed attention of a mother who has adjusted her perception of danger to account for the very specific risks of a 1-year-old with new opinions about gravity. Then he sat down very deliberately and looked at me like I had something to do with it. Dante sat in the armchair across from the couch. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He looked at his son. Milo was still gripping the coffee table. He had transferred his assessment from Dante back to the problem of standing, which was apparently more immediately interesting. Caleb came out of the hallway, dressed, clearly having been in the back of the apartment, not disappearing when Dante arrived, but not staging himself either. He picked up his own mug from the kitchen counter, moved to the other end of the couch from Elena, opened his laptop. He and Dante exchanged a nod. The 3 of them sat in the living room in the unremarkable Saturday morning way of people who have worked out an arrangement that functions, not because it is simple or because everyone got what they wanted, but because the alternative, fighting over the small person gripping the coffee table, was something none of them were willing to do to Milo. It had taken time to get here. It had taken the better part of a year of Dante showing up exactly when the schedule said, and leaving exactly when the schedule said, and not pushing, and not maneuvering, and not applying any pressure to any edge of the arrangement. It had taken Caleb Rourke deciding, sometime around month 4, that a man who did what he said he was going to do deserved to be treated accordingly. It had taken Elena watching both of them for 8 months before she had started leaving the room during Dante's visits, instead of staying to monitor. She was in the room now, but she was reading something on her phone, not watching. That was the thing Dante held on to, on the difficult mornings when the size of what he'd lost pressed down on him with its full weight. She was in the room, but not watching. That was trust. Provisional and earned slowly, and extended only because he had made it possible through consistent and unspectacular behavior. He would take it. Milo made a sound, a decisive sound, the sound of a small person who has been contemplating something and has arrived at a decision. He let go of the coffee table. He stood there, arms slightly out, the particular trembling focus of a 1-year-old running the most complicated software he'd ever attempted. Elena looked up from her phone. Caleb looked up from his laptop. Dante sat forward in his chair. Milo took a step. It was not a graceful step. It was the kind of step that is more accurately described as a controlled forward fall, one foot lurching ahead of the other, weight redistributing with the chaotic optimism of someone who has decided that momentum is the same thing as balance. He took another one. Elena's hand moved, the automatic reach of a mother, the reach she had been making for 12 months, the reach that had become so instinctive it preceded conscious decision. She stopped. She pulled her hand back. She watched. Milo took a third step and a fourth, and then sat down very suddenly in the middle of the living room floor, landing with a soft thud and a brief expression of surprise, and then looking around at the 3 adults in the room with the expression of someone checking whether what just happened was good or bad. Elena laughed. It was the same laugh from the photograph, the genuine one, the one without social calibration. Caleb was smiling, his laptop forgotten. And Dante? Dante was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his coffee mug dangling from one hand, and he was looking at his son sitting in the middle of the living room floor, and he felt something he could not have named in any language of power or strategy or the management of outcomes. He felt, for the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, sufficient, not triumphant, not in control, just sufficient. Like a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing, with exactly what he actually has. Milo looked at him. Dante looked back. "You did that," Dante said. Milo appeared to consider crediting him, then decided against it, and began the process of getting back to the coffee table. He left at noon, the same way he always left. Shoes on at the door, mug rinsed in the kitchen sink, out of a habit that had started somewhere around month 3, when Elena had mentioned, in passing, that Caleb always rinsed his, and Dante had quietly registered this as information. Elena walked him to the door. They stood in the doorway for a moment. Not long. 30 seconds. The kind of moment that has stopped needing to be anything other than what it is. "He did well," Dante said. "He did," Elena agreed. He looked at her. He thought about the woman who had sat on a bathroom floor counting pregnancy tests, and the woman who had returned $30,000 without a second thought, and the woman who had stood in a hospital room at 6 days postpartum and told him not today with the complete and unashamed authority of someone who had earned the right to that boundary through everything she had survived to get there. He thought about all the versions of her he had known, and the version standing in front of him now, a little tired around the eyes, in a gray sweater, with dried baby food on her left sleeve that she hadn't noticed yet, certain and quiet and entirely herself. "You look good," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I have something on my sleeve." "I know." He nodded at it. "Still." She looked down, found the baby food, made a face, looked back at him. The moment held. He said nothing else. There was nothing else to say that wouldn't cost more than it gave, and he had spent a year learning the discipline of not spending what wasn't his. He turned and walked to the elevator. Behind him, he heard the apartment door close. Not hard, just closed. The soft, final sound of a door that belongs to a home, in the specific quiet of a Saturday morning in Lincoln Park, where a small person named Elena Marlowe was pulling himself back to a coffee table and reconsidering the problem of standing, and 2 people who loved him were in the room paying the kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. Dante rode the elevator down. He walked through the lobby, pushed through the door into the November air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around him, traffic and wind and the ordinary, relentless machinery of a place that had never adjusted itself for anyone's disasters or discoveries. The same city that had spread out below his window for 11 years. The same indifferent, enormous, cold, and vital place. He pulled his coat against the wind. He thought about what Bianca had said in the kitchen of the lakeside estate, months ago, in another version of his life. You assumed you were the one running the game. He thought about the things he knew now that he hadn't known then. He thought about his son walking 4 steps in a Lincoln Park living room and sitting down on the floor and looking around for confirmation that it mattered. He started walking. No destination specifically, just walking. The particular aimless motion of a man who has finished something and is not yet sure what comes next, but is for the first time in a long time willing to find out without deciding in advance what the answer should be. He walked for 3 blocks. Then he stopped. He stood in front of a coffee shop he had passed 100 times without entering, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he went inside and ordered a coffee and sat at a table by the window and watched the city move, the way ordinary people sit in ordinary coffee shops and watch the city move. He sat there for 40 minutes. He was not managing anything. He was not calculating anything. He was just sitting in the evidence of a life that had been broken open and not entirely put back together, and would probably never be put back together in the original form, which was, he understood now, not a failure of reconstruction, but a feature of it. You don't rebuild what was wrong with it. You build what you actually have. He pulled out his phone. He looked at the photograph he had saved, not the one his consigliere had placed on his desk, the surveillance photograph of Elena laughing in a gray coat. A different one. One he had taken himself, on his 4th Saturday visit, when Milo had fallen asleep on his chest for 20 minutes while Elena was in the other room, and Caleb had quietly put a blanket over both of them without making anything of it. Milo's face, slack with sleep. Dante's hand, large and uncertain, resting on his son's back. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put his phone away. He picked up his coffee. Outside the window, November Chicago moved through itself, indifferent and alive. And Dante Vescari sat inside it, smaller than he had been, more solid, without the armor and without the distance, and drank his coffee and waited for whatever came next without trying to be the one who decided what it was.